In the Sierra Nevada mountains of Northern California, where ancient pines whisper secrets to the wind and shadows grow long even in daylight, there exists a place that time seems to have forgotten. The Keddie Resort, once a bustling railroad town, had withered into a collection of weathered cabins scattered like broken teeth across the mountainside. By 1981, it had become a haven for those seeking to disappear, families running from debt, single mothers escaping bad marriages, drifters looking for cheap rent and anonymity. The cabins themselves seemed to crouch in the wilderness, their wood-paneled walls stained dark with decades of mountain weather. Cabin 28 sat among them like any other, unremarkable in its modest construction, identical to its neighbors with their peaked roofs and small windows that gazed out into the endless forest. But within those walls, on a spring night when the mountain air still carried winter's bite, something would happen that would transform this quiet retreat into one of America's most haunting unsolved mysteries. The forest remembers everything. The trees that surrounded Keddie had witnessed the coming of the railroad, the boom and bust of logging, the slow decay of prosperity. They had seen families come and go, heard laughter and tears, watched children grow and parents age. But nothing in their long memory compared to what they would witness on the night of April 11, 1981. Sue Sharp had the kind of tired eyes that spoke of too many disappointments and not enough sleep. At 36, she carried herself with the weary determination of a woman who had learned that if she didn't fight for her children, no one else would. The divorce had been brutal, leaving her with 5 kids and barely enough money to survive. When she heard about the cheap rent in Keddie, it seemed like a blessing, a place to start over, to heal, to maybe find some peace. The drive up Highway 70 in late 1980 had been quiet, her children pressed against the windows of their overloaded car, watching the landscape change from valley floor to mountain forest. 14-year-old Sheila sat in the front seat, already showing the signs of premature responsibility that eldest children in struggling families often bear. Johnny, 15, tried to project teenage indifference but couldn't hide his excitement at the prospect of adventure. Tina, 12, clutched a worn stuffed animal, her dark eyes wide as she took in their new surroundings. The 2 youngest, Rick and Greg, ages 10 and 5, chattered excitedly about living in the mountains. Cabin 28 welcomed them with the musty smell of disuse and the creaking sounds old wood makes when disturbed. Sue walked through the small rooms, her footsteps echoing on the worn linoleum, and tried to envision it as home. The living room opened directly into a small kitchen, separated only by a breakfast bar. 2 bedrooms branched off the main area, one for her, one for the boys. Sheila and Tina would share the futon in the living room. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. The neighbors were an eclectic mix of fellow refugees from mainstream society. There was Martin Smart, a former Marine whose quick temper and drinking problem had cost him his military career. His wife Marilyn tried to keep peace, but everyone could hear the shouting that came from their cabin late at night. Bo Boobeed, Smart's friend, was a drifter with cold eyes and a past he never discussed. The Seabolt family seemed more stable, with teenage sons who quickly became friends with Johnny and Rick Sharp. As winter gave way to spring, Sue began to feel something she hadn't experienced in years: hope. The children were adjusting well to their new school, making friends, exploring the endless forest that surrounded their home. Johnny had grown close to Dana Wingate, a gentle 17-year-old from a neighboring town who often stayed over for sleepovers and friendly gatherings. Tina was blossoming into a beautiful young woman, her laugh ringing through the cabin as she helped with household chores. But in a place like Keddie, where people came to escape their pasts, those pasts had a way of following them. The mountains might offer isolation, but they also offered perfect cover for those who preferred to conduct their business away from prying eyes. And as the snow melted and the days grew longer, something dark was stirring in the shadows between the cabins. Sue began to notice things that made her uneasy. Martin Smart's visits became more frequent, his excuses more transparent. He would appear at her door with offers to help with repairs, his eyes lingering too long on her daughters. When she politely declined his advances, his friendly demeanor would shift, revealing something harder underneath. Bo Boobeed watched from the shadows, saying little but seeing everything, his presence somehow more threatening than Smart's obvious aggression. The other neighbors began to avoid the Sharp family, as if some sixth sense warned them to keep their distance. Children who had played with Rick and Greg were suddenly called inside when they appeared. Adult conversations stopped when Sue approached. Even the Seabolts, who had been genuinely welcoming, seemed to withdraw into their own cabin as spring progressed. Sue told herself she was being paranoid. They were finally stable, finally safe. The children were happy. She had a job cleaning rooms at a nearby resort that provided enough income to keep them housed and fed. Life was far from perfect, but it was better than it had been in years. She couldn't shake the feeling, however, that something was building toward a confrontation she wasn't prepared for. The forest seemed to be holding its breath. April 11, 1981, began like any other Saturday in the Sharp household. The morning sun filtered through the pine trees, casting dancing shadows across the cabin's small windows. Sue had the day off from her cleaning job, a rare luxury that allowed her to sleep in until the sounds of her children's morning routine woke her. The familiar chaos of a family getting started, cereal bowls clattering, siblings bickering over bathroom time, the television providing a constant backdrop of Saturday morning cartoons, should have been comforting. Instead, Sue felt an inexplicable tension in the air, as if the very atmosphere around Cabin 28 was charged with anticipation. Sheila had made plans to spend the night at the Siebold house with friends, a sleepover that would celebrate the approaching end of the school year. At 14, she was becoming increasingly independent, and Sue was proud of how responsible her eldest daughter had become. Sheila helped pack a small bag, kissed her mother goodbye, and walked the short distance to the Siebold cabin, her voice carrying back through the trees as she called greetings to neighbors working in their yards. The remaining family settled into their Saturday routine. Johnny and Rick played outside, their voices echoing off the cabin walls as they invented elaborate games in the forest. Tina helped Sue with household chores, the two of them working companionably while Greg watched cartoons. It was peaceful, domestic, normal, everything Sue had hoped for when she brought her family to this remote mountain community. As evening approached, Dana Wingate arrived for what had become a regular weekend tradition. The 17-year-old had become like an older brother to the Sharp boys, and his presence always brought an extra energy to the household. Johnny looked up to him, and even shy Tina seemed more animated when Dana was around. Sue appreciated having another responsible teenager in the house, someone who could help keep an eye on the younger children while she handled the endless tasks of single parenthood. Dinner was a simple affair, canned soup and sandwiches eaten while gathered around the small television. The boys peppered Dana with questions about high school, about cars, about the mysterious world of teenage independence they were eager to enter. Dana answered with good-natured patience, his easy laugh filling the small living space. For a few hours, Cabin 28 felt like a normal family home, insulated from whatever darkness lurked in the mountain shadows. As the evening wore on, Sue began to feel the familiar exhaustion that came with her demanding schedule. The combination of physical labor at her cleaning job and the constant vigilance required to raise 5 children alone was taking its toll. She said goodnight to the older boys, kissed Tina and Greg, and retreated to her bedroom. The sounds of muted conversation and occasional laughter from the living room were comforting as she drifted toward sleep. Outside, the mountain night was settling over Keddie with its usual stillness. The temperature was dropping, and a light wind moved through the pine trees with a sound like whispered warnings. Most of the cabin showed only a few lit windows, families settling in for the night, children being tucked into bed, adults preparing for another week of work. But not everyone in Keddie was settling down for peaceful sleep. In the shadows between cabins, figures moved with purpose. Martin Smart had been drinking heavily, his anger and frustration building throughout the day like pressure in a sealed container. Bo Boobeed sat in the darkness of his cabin, sharpening a knife with methodical precision, his cold eyes reflecting what little light filtered through his windows. Whatever had been building between these men and the Sharp family was reaching its culmination. Sue's last conscious thought was gratitude for the quiet evening, for the sound of her children safe in the next room, for the simple blessing of a roof over their heads. She couldn't know that this would be the last normal moment her family would ever experience, that the peace she felt was only the calm before a storm that would shatter their lives forever. In the living room, Johnny, Dana, Tina, and little Greg continued their quiet evening, unaware that malevolent forces were gathering in the darkness outside their door. The television provided a soft backdrop of sound, and the warm glow of the lamps made the small space feel secure and protected. They were just a family and their friend, spending a quiet Saturday night together, innocent of the horror that was moving toward them through the mountain darkness. The last few hours of normalcy ticked away like a countdown to catastrophe. The exact time when evil entered Cabin 28 will never be known with certainty. Somewhere between the late evening hours of April 11th and the early morning darkness of April 12th, when the mountain silence was broken only by the whisper of wind through pine needles and the distant sound of the Feather River rushing over stones, something unspeakably terrible began to unfold. The first indication that this night would be different from any other came not with a dramatic crash or sudden violence, but with the subtle sound of footsteps on the wooden porch outside the Sharp family's front door. In the living room, Johnny and Dana were still awake, their conversation having grown quieter as the night deepened. Tina was dozing on the couch, and young Greg had fallen asleep in his chair, his small form curled peacefully in the glow of the television. When the knock came, it was neither urgent nor threatening. It sounded like any neighbor might make, firm but polite, the kind of knock that suggested someone needed to borrow something or deliver a message. Johnny, ever helpful and unsuspecting, rose to answer the door. The chain of events that would follow his turning of that door handle would transform the Sharp family's story from one of hope and new beginnings into one of unimaginable horror. Martin Smart stood on the porch, but he was not alone. Bo Boobede's silhouette was visible behind him, and there was at least one other figure whose identity would become one of the many mysteries surrounding this night. Smart's demeanor had changed from the friendly neighbor persona he usually affected. His eyes were glazed with alcohol and something far more dangerous, a rage that had been building for months, fed by rejection and humiliation and whatever twisted thoughts had been growing in his mind. What happened next unfolded with the terrible inevitability of a nightmare. The men pushed their way into the cabin, bringing with them an atmosphere of violence that immediately transformed the peaceful family space into something far more sinister. Johnny and Dana, teenagers who had never faced anything more threatening than school bullies, found themselves confronting adult men intent on unspeakable acts. The living room became a battleground. Furniture was overturned as the boys tried desperately to defend themselves and protect Tina and Greg. The sounds of struggle filled the small space, bodies hitting walls, the crash of breaking items, voices raised in fear and anger. Dana, despite his youth, fought with desperate courage, trying to shield the younger children from harm. Johnny, his protective instincts fully aroused, fought alongside his friend against overwhelming odds. But courage and desperation were no match for the calculated brutality of their attackers. The men had come prepared for violence, armed with weapons that turned the small cabin into a slaughterhouse. The details of what followed are too horrific for complete telling, but the evidence left behind would paint a picture of prolonged torture and unimaginable cruelty. Tina, awakened by the sounds of struggle, found herself trapped in a waking nightmare. The 12-year-old girl who had been peacefully dozing moments before was suddenly thrust into a situation no child should ever have to face. Her screams joined those of her brothers and Dana, creating a symphony of terror that echoed through the thin walls of Cabin 28 and out into the mountain darkness. Yet somehow, miraculously, little Greg slept through the initial chaos. Whether it was the deep sleep of childhood, exhaustion, or some merciful unconsciousness brought on by trauma, the 5-year-old remained unaware as horror unfolded around him. This would prove to be his salvation, though the psychological scars of what he would eventually discover would mark him for life. In the master bedroom, Sue Sharp was awakened not by sound but by some primal instinct that all was not well. The mother's sixth sense that had kept her family together through divorce, poverty, and uncertainty now screamed that her children were in mortal danger. But when she tried to rise from her bed, she found her path blocked by one of the intruders who had positioned himself specifically to prevent her from interfering with what was happening in the living room. The conversation that followed between Sue and her captor would remain forever unknown, but the evidence would suggest that she fought with the fierce desperation of a mother protecting her young. Unfortunately, her courage and determination were no match for the calculated brutality she faced. Whatever last words were spoken in that bedroom, whatever final pleas were made, they fell on ears that had already closed themselves to human mercy. As the night reached its deepest, darkest hour, the sounds from Cabin 28 finally began to fade. The struggle was ending, not because justice had prevailed or help had arrived, but because the attackers had achieved whatever twisted goals had brought them there. The silence that followed was somehow more terrible than the sounds of violence had been, pregnant with the weight of irreversible tragedy. But the nightmare was not yet complete. In a final act of calculated evil, Tina Sharp was taken from the cabin, removed from the scene for reasons that would remain forever unclear. Whether this was part of the original plan or a spontaneous decision made in the heat of violence, the abduction of the 12-year-old girl added another layer of horror to an already unthinkable crime. As dawn approached the Sierra Nevada mountains, Cabin 28 stood silent in the growing light. To any casual observer, it might have appeared that the Sharp family was simply sleeping in after a late Saturday night. But inside those walls, a scene of carnage waited to be discovered that would shock even hardened law enforcement officers and haunt the small community of Keddie forever. The forest had witnessed unspeakable evil, and the mountains would keep their secrets well. Sunday morning, April 12, 1981, dawned crisp and clear over the Keddie Resort. The early sunlight filtering through the pine trees should have brought with it the peaceful promise of another quiet mountain day. Instead, it illuminated the scene of one of California's most brutal and baffling multiple murders. Sheila Sharp had enjoyed her sleepover at the Seabolt house, spending the night giggling with friends and sharing the kind of innocent secrets that occupy teenage girls. At 14, she was old enough to appreciate the freedom of a night away from her younger siblings, but still young enough to miss her family and look forward to returning home for Sunday breakfast. As she walked the short distance between the cabins that morning, her mind was occupied with typical teenage concerns: school assignments due Monday, plans with friends, the approaching summer vacation. The first thing she noticed as she approached Cabin 28 was how quiet it seemed. Usually by this time on a Sunday morning, her mother would have the coffee brewing and the younger children would be stirring, filling the small space with their chatter and activity. Instead, an unusual stillness hung over the cabin like a shroud. Sheila's first thought was that everyone was sleeping in, enjoying a rare lazy Sunday morning. She climbed the wooden steps to the front door, noting absently that it was slightly ajar, unusual for her security-conscious mother, but not alarming enough to cause real concern. Perhaps Dana had stepped outside for some fresh air, or one of the boys had gone out to play. She pushed the door open and called out a cheerful greeting to her family. The silence that answered her call was complete and somehow wrong. Sheila stepped inside, her eyes taking a moment to adjust from the bright morning sunlight to the dimmer interior of the cabin. What she saw in those first few seconds would be seared into her memory forever, a tableau of horror that no 14-year-old should ever have to witness. The living room was in chaos. Furniture was overturned, personal belongings scattered across the floor. Dark stains covered surfaces that should have been clean. But it was the sight of the bodies that stopped Sheila's heart and filled her throat with the scream that would bring the neighbors running. Johnny lay motionless, her 15-year-old brother who had teased her mercilessly and protected her fiercely reduced to stillness in a way that defied comprehension. Nearby was Dana, the gentle teenager who had become like family, his life cut short just as it was beginning to unfold. The violence that had been done to them was immediately apparent, even to Sheila's young eyes. This was not an accident or a natural death, this was murder of the most brutal kind. But as terrible as the scene was, it was what Sheila didn't see that would haunt her most. Where was her mother? Where were Tina and Greg? The bedroom door stood open, revealing another scene of violence, but no sign of her youngest siblings. In her shock and terror, Sheila's mind struggled to process what had happened to the rest of her family. Her screams brought the neighbors at a run. Martin Smart was among the first to arrive, his face a mask of concern and shock that would later seem incongruous to investigators familiar with his role in the night's events. Other residents of the Keddie Resort followed, clustering around the cabin but afraid to enter, sensing that something unspeakable had occurred within those walls. Someone had the presence of mind to call the authorities, though in the remote mountain location, it would be some time before professional help could arrive. The Plumas County Sheriff's Department was located in Quincy, more than an hour's drive away over winding mountain roads. Until they could get there, the residents of Keddie were left to guard the scene and try to comfort a traumatized teenager whose world had been shattered in the space of a few terrible hours. As word spread through the small community, a crowd began to gather around Cabin 28. Some came out of genuine concern and desire to help, others drawn by the morbid curiosity that accompanies any tragedy. The scene was chaotic, with people tracking through what would later be recognized as crucial evidence, contaminating what should have been a sterile crime scene. In all the confusion and horror, one small miracle emerged. 5-year-old Greg Sharp was found alive, hidden in a bedroom and apparently unharmed. How the youngest member of the family had survived the night of terror that claimed his mother, brother, and Dana Wingate would remain one of the many mysteries surrounding the case. Some theorized that his attackers had overlooked him in the darkness, others that they had deliberately spared the youngest child. Greg himself would have no memory of the events, his young mind apparently protecting him from trauma too severe to process. But 12-year-old Tina Sharp was nowhere to be found. A systematic search of the cabin revealed no trace of the girl who had been present the night before. Her absence added another horrifying dimension to the crime. Had she escaped into the forest? Had she been taken? Was she lying injured somewhere, waiting for rescue? As the hours passed without any sign of her, the terrible possibility that she too was dead began to settle over the investigators like a suffocating weight. The arrival of the Plumas County Sheriff's Department brought professional law enforcement to the scene, but even experienced officers were shaken by what they found in Cabin 28. The level of violence was shocking even by big city standards, but this was a small mountain community where the most serious crimes were usually theft or domestic disputes. Nothing in their experience had prepared them for a multiple murder scene of such brutality. As the investigation began in earnest, certain disturbing facts quickly emerged. The killers had not been strangers passing through, they had intimate knowledge of the Sharp family's routines and the layout of the cabin. The attack had been personal, driven by something more than simple robbery or random violence. This was targeted, planned, and executed with a level of brutality that spoke to deep personal animosity. The forest around Keddie seemed to close in as law enforcement officers and volunteers began searching for any trace of Tina Sharp. Bloodhounds were brought in, tracking dogs followed scent trails that led in circles and then disappeared. Helicopters circled overhead, their rotors chopping the mountain air as they scanned the dense woods for any sign of the missing girl. But the mountains kept their secrets well, and as the day wore on without any discoveries, hope for finding Tina alive began to fade. The sun that had risen on what should have been a peaceful Sunday morning now set on a community forever changed. The residents of Keddie would never again feel the simple security they had taken for granted. Evil had visited their mountain retreat, and it had left behind questions that would haunt them for decades to come. The investigation into the Keddie Cabin murders began under the worst possible circumstances. The crime scene had been compromised by well-meaning neighbors, crucial evidence had been disturbed or destroyed, and the remote mountain location made it difficult to bring adequate resources to bear on the case. Detective Mike Gamberg, years later, would describe the initial investigation as a series of missteps and missed opportunities that severely hampered any hope of quick resolution. The Plumas County Sheriff's Department, led by Sheriff Doug Thomas, found themselves facing the most complex and brutal murder case in the county's history. With a limited budget, small staff, and little experience with major crimes, they were immediately overwhelmed by the scope and brutality of what had occurred at Cabin 28. The decision was made to call in assistance from the California Department of Justice, but coordination between agencies would prove problematic from the very beginning. The physical evidence at the scene told a story of prolonged torture and savage violence. Multiple weapons had been used in the attack, including knives, a hammer, and what appeared to be martial arts weapons. The attackers had taken their time, suggesting that they were confident they would not be interrupted, a fact that implied intimate knowledge of the family's habits and the community's routines. Blood spatter analysis, still a relatively new forensic technique in 1981, revealed that the violence had occurred over an extended period and in multiple locations within the cabin. The living room bore the heaviest concentration of evidence, but blood was found throughout the small dwelling, painting a picture of victims trying desperately to escape their attackers only to be cornered and murdered. One of the most puzzling aspects of the crime scene was the apparent mixture of careful planning and chaotic execution. The attackers had clearly prepared for violence, bringing multiple weapons and apparently knowing when the cabin would be most vulnerable. Yet the scene itself showed signs of prolonged struggle and what appeared to be improvised brutality, as if the original plan had gone awry and the situation had escalated beyond what was intended. The search for Tina Sharp continued throughout the days following the discovery of the bodies. Every available officer was pressed into service, joined by volunteers from throughout the region. The dense forest surrounding Keddie offered countless places where a body could be hidden, and the searchers covered miles of terrain without finding any trace of the missing girl. Bloodhounds followed scent trails that seemed to lead in every direction before disappearing entirely, as if Tina had simply vanished into the mountain air. Interviews with neighbors and community members began immediately, though the small, tight-knit community of Keddie proved surprisingly uncooperative. People who had lived side by side for years suddenly claimed to have heard nothing, seen nothing, and known nothing about potential conflicts involving the Sharp family. The code of silence that often protects small communities from outside scrutiny was working against the investigation from the very beginning. Martin Smart emerged as an early person of interest, though his status as a concerned neighbor who had responded to Sheila's screams provided him with a ready explanation for his presence at the scene. His wife Marilyn provided an alibi for his whereabouts during the critical hours, though investigators noted that she seemed nervous and evasive during questioning. Bo Boo Bede, Smart's friend and frequent companion, also claimed to have been elsewhere during the murders, but his alibi was similarly difficult to verify. The weapon recovery efforts yielded mixed results. A bloody hammer was found discarded near the cabin, apparently thrown there by the attackers as they fled. A bent knife, broken during the attack, was discovered embedded in the living room wall. But other weapons that had clearly been used in the assault were never located, suggesting that the killers had retained some of their tools or disposed of them more carefully. Forensic analysis of the scene revealed the presence of multiple perpetrators. Footprint evidence, blood patterns, and the sheer scope of the violence all pointed to a coordinated attack by at least 3 individuals. The level of organization required for such an assault indicated that this was not a spontaneous crime of passion, but rather a planned execution that had been thought through in advance. One of the most disturbing discoveries was evidence that the victims had been tortured before being killed. The medical examiner's preliminary findings suggested that the attack had lasted for hours, with the victims suffering multiple non-fatal wounds before finally succumbing to their injuries. This level of deliberate cruelty pointed to personal animosity between the attackers and their victims, ruling out random violence or simple robbery as motives. As the initial investigation progressed, certain inconsistencies in witness statements began to emerge. Several neighbors claimed to have seen suspicious activity around Cabin 28 in the days leading up to the murders, but their descriptions of what they had observed varied significantly. Some reported seeing unfamiliar vehicles in the area, others mentioned hearing raised voices or sounds of argument. But when pressed for specific details, witnesses often became vague or changed their stories entirely. The investigation was further complicated by the discovery that several potential pieces of evidence had disappeared from the scene before law enforcement could properly catalog them. Items that neighbors claimed to have seen in the immediate aftermath of the murders were nowhere to be found when investigators arrived. Whether this was due to well-meaning cleanup efforts or deliberate evidence tampering would never be determined, but it added another layer of frustration to an already difficult case. As days turned to weeks without any major breakthroughs, the pressure on law enforcement intensified. The media had picked up the story, turning the Keddie Cabin Murders into a sensation that brought unwanted attention to the small mountain community. Reporters descended on the area, interviewing anyone willing to talk and speculating wildly about motives and suspects. The circus atmosphere made it even more difficult for investigators to conduct thorough interviews and gather reliable evidence. The continuing search for Tina Sharp remained a priority, but as time passed, the focus began to shift from rescue to recovery. The harsh mountain terrain and the passage of time made it increasingly unlikely that the 12-year-old girl had survived, wherever she might be. The search area was expanded repeatedly, eventually covering hundreds of square miles of wilderness, but still no trace of Tina was found. 3 weeks after the murders, on a warm spring day when the mountain wildflowers were just beginning to bloom, a group of bottle collectors searching for discarded containers in a remote area near Camp 18 made a grisly discovery. Partially concealed under forest debris, they found human remains that were quickly identified as those of Tina Sharp. The location was 28 miles from Keddie, in an area that had been searched multiple times without success. The discovery of Tina's body answered some questions but raised many others. The remote location suggested that her abduction had been planned in advance, with the killers having a predetermined disposal site in mind. The condition of the remains indicated that she had been killed shortly after being taken from the cabin, ruling out any hope that she might have been held captive for any extended period. The discovery of Tina Sharp's body should have provided the breakthrough that investigators desperately needed, but instead it seemed to deepen the mystery surrounding the Keddie Cabin murders. The forensic evidence from her remains told a story that was both heartbreaking and baffling, adding new dimensions to a case that was already stretching the resources and capabilities of rural law enforcement to their breaking point. The location where Tina's body was found raised immediate questions about the killer's knowledge of the area. Camp 18 was not easily accessible and was far from any main road or popular hiking trail. The fact that the murderers had been able to transport a body there and conceal it effectively suggested intimate familiarity with the remote mountain terrain. This was not the work of strangers passing through, but rather individuals who knew the Sierra Nevada wilderness well enough to navigate it in darkness and find a suitable disposal site. Dr. Anthony Silvera, the forensic pathologist who examined Tina's remains, determined that she had been killed by multiple stab wounds, similar to the violence that had claimed the lives of her mother, brother, and Dana Wingate. However, the evidence also suggested that she had been alive for some time after being taken from Cabin 28, raising the horrifying possibility that she had witnessed the murders of her family members before becoming a victim herself. The 3-week delay between Tina's disappearance and the discovery of her body created significant challenges for the forensic analysis. The mountain environment had accelerated decomposition, making it difficult to determine precise timing and circumstances of death. However, certain evidence recovered from the scene would prove crucial to the eventual investigation. though it would be years before its full significance was understood. Back in Keddie, the small community was struggling to come to terms with the reality that such violence could occur in their quiet mountain retreat. The resort, which had been home to dozens of families seeking peace and affordable housing, began to empty as residents decided they could no longer feel safe in the shadow of Cabin 28. Property values plummeted, and the local economy, already fragile, suffered a blow from which it would never fully recover. The Sharp family's surviving children faced the unimaginable task of rebuilding their lives after losing their mother, 2 siblings, and their sense of security in a single night. Sheila, who had discovered the bodies, required extensive psychological counseling to deal with the trauma of what she had witnessed. Young Greg, who had somehow survived the attack, struggled with survivor's guilt and the knowledge that his family had been murdered while he slept nearby, unable to help or even fully understand what was happening. As the investigation progressed, patterns began to emerge in witness statements that suggested a conspiracy of silence was protecting the killers. Multiple residents of Keddie reported having information about the murders, but when questioned formally, their stories would change or they would claim to have been mistaken about what they had seen or heard. The small mountain community's tradition of keeping to itself and not involving outsiders in local affairs was now shielding those responsible for multiple murders. Martin Smart's behavior in the weeks following the murders became increasingly erratic. Neighbors reported that he had been drinking more heavily than usual and making cryptic comments about justice being done and people getting what they deserved. His wife Marilyn appeared increasingly nervous and withdrawn, avoiding contact with other residents and keeping to her cabin unless absolutely necessary to venture out. Bo Bede's response to the investigation was markedly different from Smart's. While Smart grew more agitated and vocal, Bo Bede became even more withdrawn and careful. He seemed to anticipate questions before they were asked and provided answers that were technically truthful but revealed nothing of substance. His military background and experience with interrogation techniques made him a formidable opponent for investigators who were already working with limited resources and experience. The investigation took an unexpected turn when investigators discovered that phone records from the night of the murders showed several calls made to and from numbers associated with known criminals in the Sacramento area. The timing of these calls suggested possible coordination between local perpetrators and outside accomplices, raising the possibility that the Keddie Cabin murders were part of a larger criminal conspiracy. This revelation led to a broader investigation that eventually connected the murders to ongoing drug trafficking operations in Northern California. The remote location of Keddie, combined with its transient population and limited law enforcement presence, had apparently made it attractive to criminals seeking to establish distribution networks away from urban scrutiny. The Sharp family's murder may have been related to their inadvertent discovery of these activities, or to their refusal to cooperate with criminal demands. As investigators delved deeper into this possibility, they uncovered a complex web of relationships and financial transactions that painted a picture of corruption extending far beyond the small mountain community. Evidence suggested that some law enforcement officials might have been compromised, either through bribery or intimidation, and that the investigation itself might have been sabotaged from within. The discovery of this potential corruption added another layer of complexity to an already challenging case. Investigators found themselves unsure of whom they could trust, and evidence began to disappear from storage facilities or become misfiled in ways that made it inaccessible to the investigative team. The case that had begun as a straightforward murder investigation was now revealing connections to organized crime, police corruption, and a cover-up that reached into the highest levels of local government. Despite these obstacles, dedicated investigators continued to work the case, following leads wherever they might lead and building a comprehensive picture of what had happened on that terrible April night. Physical evidence continued to be processed and analyzed, witness statements were cross-referenced and verified, and the complex web of relationships within the Keddie community was slowly untangled. The breakthrough that investigators had been hoping for finally came from an unexpected source. A former associate of Bo Bede, facing his own legal troubles on unrelated charges, approached authorities with information about conversations he had overheard in the weeks following the murders. According to this witness, Bo Bede had bragged about teaching the Sharp family a lesson and had made specific references to details of the crime that had not been released to the public. This testimony provided the first direct link between a specific suspect and the murders, but it also raised new questions about motive and planning. If Bo Bede's statements were accurate, the attack on the Sharp family had been motivated by personal animosity rather than criminal business considerations. The distinction was important, because it suggested that the murders had been planned and personal rather than professional hits designed to silence potential witnesses. As the investigation entered its second year, The case of the Keddie Cabin Murders had become one of the most frustrating and complex criminal investigations in California history. Every lead seemed to spawn 3 more questions, every answer revealed new contradictions, and the web of lies, half-truths, and deliberate misdirection surrounding the case grew ever more tangled. The testimony from Bo Boobeed's associate had provided investigators with their first real breakthrough, but it also opened new avenues of inquiry that stretched their limited resources even thinner. If Boobeed had indeed bragged about the murders, it suggested a level of confidence that the perpetrators would never be prosecuted, confidence that could only come from knowing that powerful forces were protecting them. Detective Mike Gamberg, who would later take over the cold case investigation decades later, would describe this period as the most crucial phase of the original investigation. Evidence was still fresh, witnesses were still alive, and the crime scene still held secrets that could potentially be unlocked with proper analysis. Unfortunately, the combination of limited resources, jurisdictional disputes, and what appeared to be deliberate interference prevented investigators from capitalizing on their advantages. Martin Smart's behavior continued to deteriorate throughout this period. Neighbors reported increasingly bizarre incidents involving the former Marine, including episodes where he would stand outside cabin 28 in the middle of the night, talking to himself and gesturing at the empty building. His drinking had progressed from heavy to chronic, and his wife Marilyn appeared to be living in constant fear of his explosive temper. During one particularly revealing incident, Smart reportedly approached a neighbor and made cryptic references to cleaning up loose ends and ensuring that certain people kept their mouths shut. When the neighbor asked for clarification, Smart became aggressive and threatening, warning that what happened to the Sharps could happen to anyone who didn't mind their own business. These incidents were reported to investigators, but follow-up was inconsistent and often delayed. By the time officers arrived to question Smart about specific incidents, he would claim no memory of the conversations or provide alternative explanations that were difficult to verify. His wife's increasingly nervous demeanor suggested that she might have information that could break the case open, but attempts to interview her separately were blocked by Smart's constant presence and apparent control over her activities. The investigation took another dark turn when evidence began to surface suggesting that the murders might have been connected to a broader pattern of violence and intimidation in the region. Similar unsolved cases in neighboring counties showed disturbing parallels to the Keddie murders: multiple victims, extreme violence, and investigations that seemed to stall just as they were making progress. One particularly troubling case involved the disappearance of a family from a remote cabin near Lake Almanor, approximately 40 miles from Keddie. The family had been reported missing by relatives when they failed to appear for a planned reunion, but when authorities investigated their cabin, they found evidence of violence and signs that the building had been deliberately cleaned to remove forensic evidence. No bodies were ever found, and the case was eventually classified as a missing persons investigation rather than a homicide. The similarities between this case and the Keddie murders were striking. Both involved families living in remote mountain locations, both showed evidence of multiple attackers, and both investigations seemed to encounter unusual obstacles and lack of cooperation from local residents. The possibility that the same perpetrators were responsible for multiple crimes across the region suggested a level of organization and sophistication that local law enforcement was not equipped to handle. As investigators delved deeper into these connections, they encountered increasing resistance from within their own departments. Evidence requests were delayed or denied, witness interviews were rescheduled or canceled without explanation, and crucial forensic analyses were inexplicably postponed. The pattern suggested that someone with significant influence was working to hamper the investigation, though identifying the source of this interference proved impossible. The pressure on investigators was compounded by media attention that had turned the Keddie Cabin murders into a national sensation. Television programs, newspaper articles, and true crime magazines all featured the case, often presenting theories and speculation that had no basis in the actual evidence. This media circus made it even more difficult for investigators to conduct thorough interviews and gather reliable information. One of the most significant developments during this period came from an unexpected source. Marilyn Smart, Martin's wife, finally agreed to speak with investigators without her husband's presence. The interview, conducted in secret at a location away from Keddie, revealed information that would fundamentally change the direction of the investigation. According to Marilyn, her husband had returned to their cabin in the early morning hours of April 12, covered in what appeared to be blood and in a state of extreme agitation. His clothing was torn and dirty, suggesting involvement in a violent struggle, and he had immediately ordered her to help him dispose of bloody items including clothing and what appeared to be weapons. More damaging still was Marilyn's claim that Martin had confessed to her his involvement in the Sharp family murders, describing them as necessary to protect their way of life and ensure that troublemakers didn't interfere with their business activities. According to her statement, Martin had worked with Bo Boobeed and at least one other individual to plan and execute the attack on Cabin 28. The motive, as Marilyn understood it, was related to Sue Sharp's unwillingness to allow her property to be used for drug trafficking activities. The Sharp family's cabin was apparently in a strategic location for the distribution network that Smart and his associates were operating, and Sue's refusal to cooperate had made her a target for elimination. This testimony provided investigators with their strongest case to date, but it also put Marilyn Smart in tremendous danger. Within hours of giving her statement, she had disappeared from the safe house where investigators had placed her, leaving behind only a note saying that she could not continue to live in fear and was going somewhere her husband could never find her. The disappearance of their key witness was a devastating blow to the investigation. Without Marilyn's testimony, the case against Martin Smart and Bo Boobeed remained largely circumstantial, based on suspicious behavior and unreliable witness accounts rather than concrete evidence. Efforts to locate Marilyn and convince her to return proved futile, as she had apparently vanished as completely as if the mountain wilderness had swallowed her. The years that followed Marilyn Smart's disappearance were marked by frustration, dead ends, and the gradual realization that the Keddie Cabin murders might never be solved through conventional investigative methods. The case officially remained open, but active investigation was scaled back as resources were redirected to newer crimes with more promising leads. Martin Smart and Bo Boobeed continued to live in the Keddie area for several more years, their presence a constant reminder to the community of the unsolved murders that had shattered their sense of security. Smart's behavior became increasingly erratic, and he was arrested multiple times on minor charges related to alcohol abuse and disturbing the peace. During these arrests, he would sometimes make cryptic references to the Sharp family murders, but nothing he said provided concrete evidence that could be used in court. Bo Boobeed maintained his silence and careful demeanor, never giving investigators any opening that might lead to charges. His military training and experience with interrogation had served him well, and he seemed to understand exactly how far he could go without crossing legal lines that would give authorities grounds for prosecution. The surviving members of the Sharp family struggled to rebuild their lives while living with the knowledge that their loved ones' killers remained free. Sheila Sharp, who had discovered the bodies, battled severe post-traumatic stress and found it difficult to form lasting relationships or trust other people. The image of what she had seen in Cabin 28 that terrible morning was seared into her memory, surfacing in nightmares and flashbacks that no amount of therapy seemed able to completely eliminate. Young Greg Sharp, the miraculous survivor of that night of horror, grew up with the burden of knowing that he had been spared while his mother, brother, sister, and Dana had been murdered around him. Survivor's guilt plagued him throughout his childhood and adolescence, manifesting in behavioral problems, academic difficulties, and an inability to feel safe in his own home. The other Sharp children, who had been staying elsewhere during the murders, faced their own challenges in processing the loss of most of their family. The trauma of sudden, violent loss was compounded by the frustration of knowing that those responsible had escaped justice and might still pose a threat to their safety. As the 1980s progressed into the 1990s, the Keddie Cabin murders gradually faded from public attention, becoming just another cold case in the files of the Plumas County Sheriff's Department. New generations of law enforcement officers took over the investigation, each bringing fresh perspectives but also having to start from scratch in understanding the complex web of relationships and evidence that had accumulated over the years. The original crime scene at Cabin 28 fell into disrepair, becoming a macabre tourist attraction for those fascinated by true crime. Vandals and souvenir hunters damaged what remained of the structure, further compromising any evidence that might still have been recoverable. Eventually, the cabin was demolished, removing the physical reminder of the tragedy but also eliminating any possibility of new forensic discoveries. Martin Smart died in 2000, taking whatever secrets he might have possessed to his grave. His death closed off one of the most promising avenues of investigation, though by that time he had become such an unreliable witness that his testimony might not have been credible even if he had chosen to confess. Bo Boobeed lived longer, surviving until 2004, but he maintained his silence until the end. Friends and associates would later claim that he had made deathbed confessions or provided crucial information about the murders, but these accounts were always second-hand and impossible to verify. Like Smart, he took his secrets with him when he died. The deaths of the primary suspects should have marked the end of the Keddie investigation, but instead they seemed to energize a new generation of investigators and amateur sleuths who were determined to solve the case through fresh analysis of existing evidence and new investigative techniques. In 2013, more than 3 decades after the murders, Detective Mike Gamberg of the Plumas County Sheriff's Department reopened the Keddie investigation with renewed determination and access to forensic technologies that had not existed during the original investigation. Gamberg had grown up in the area and remembered the impact the unsolved murders had on the community. As an experienced investigator, he was convinced that the case could still be solved if the evidence was properly analyzed and the investigation was conducted without the interference and corruption that had hampered the original efforts. Gamberg's first task was to locate and catalog all existing evidence from the case, a process that revealed both promising leads and troubling gaps. Much of the physical evidence had been lost, misfiled, or destroyed over the years, but enough remained to provide new opportunities for DNA analysis, fingerprint comparison, and other forensic techniques that had advanced significantly since 1981. One of the most significant discoveries was a piece of evidence that had been overlooked or deliberately hidden during the original investigation: a hammer that had been found at the scene but never properly tested for DNA or fingerprints. When modern analysis techniques were applied to this weapon, they revealed genetic material that could potentially identify the killer or killers. The DNA evidence pointed to individuals who had been suspects during the original investigation, providing the first concrete forensic link between specific people and the crime. However, the primary suspects identified by the DNA evidence were already dead, making prosecution impossible but finally providing confirmation of what investigators had long suspected about the identity of the killers. Gamberg's investigation also uncovered evidence of the cover-up that had protected the killers for so many years. Documents that had been sealed or classified were finally made available, revealing a pattern of interference and obstruction that had prevented the original investigation from reaching its logical conclusion. The corruption extended to multiple levels of law enforcement and local government, explaining why such an obvious case had never been successfully prosecuted. The revelation of this cover-up was almost as shocking as the original murders had been. The idea that law enforcement officers and public officials had deliberately protected multiple murderers for their own personal or political reasons violated every principle of justice and public service. The scope of the corruption suggested that the Keddie murders were just one part of a much larger criminal enterprise that had operated with impunity for years. Public reaction to these revelations was intense, with demands for accountability and prosecution of those who had obstructed justice. Unfortunately, most of the individuals involved in the cover-up were also dead by the time the truth came to light, making it impossible to hold them legally responsible for their crimes. For the surviving members of the Sharp family, Gamberg's investigation brought a mixture of relief and renewed pain. The confirmation that their loved ones' killers had been identified provided some measure of closure, but it also highlighted the decades of injustice they had endured while the truth was deliberately hidden from them. Sheila Sharp, now a middle-aged woman, finally learned the details of what had happened to her family that terrible night. The knowledge was both liberating and traumatic, answering questions that had haunted her for decades while also confirming the worst of her fears about the brutality and senselessness of the murders. The case officially remains open, as there are still living individuals who may have been involved in either the murders or the subsequent cover-up. Gamberg and other investigators continue to pursue leads and analyze evidence, hoping to bring charges against anyone who can still be held accountable for their crimes. Today, the site where Cabin 28 once stood is marked only by a concrete foundation slowly being reclaimed by the forest. Pine trees have grown up through the ruins, their roots breaking apart the remnants of what was once a home where a family hoped to find peace and security. The Keddie Resort itself has been largely abandoned, its remaining cabins serving as weekend retreats for visitors who may not even know about the tragedy that occurred there more than 4 decades ago. The Keddie Cabin Murders remain one of California's most notorious unsolved cases, though the recent investigation has provided answers to many of the questions that plagued the original detectives. We now know who killed Sue Sharp, Johnny Sharp, Tina Sharp, and Dana Wingate on that April night in 1981. We know why they were targeted, how the murders were planned and executed, and who worked to cover up the crimes in the years that followed. What we cannot know is what might have been if justice had been served promptly, if the investigation had been allowed to proceed without interference, if the corruption that protected the killers had been exposed and prosecuted. The Sharp family's tragedy was compounded by a system that failed them not once but repeatedly, denying them justice when it could have been achieved and forcing them to live for decades with the knowledge that their loved ones' killers walked free. The forest around Keddie continues to keep its secrets, but it also serves as a monument to the memory of those who died there. The wind in the pine trees carries their voices, the mountain streams echo their laughter, and the changing seasons mark the passage of time since their lives were so brutally cut short. For those who study true crime, The Keddie Cabin Murders serve as a reminder that evil exists in the most unexpected places and that the systems we depend on for protection can sometimes become instruments of injustice themselves. The case demonstrates the importance of thorough investigation, the dangers of corruption, and the resilience of families who refuse to give up their search for truth. The Sharp family's story is ultimately one of survival as much as tragedy. Despite losing so much, the surviving children grew up, built lives, and raised families of their own. They carried forward the memory of their murdered loved ones while refusing to be defined entirely by the trauma they had endured. Their strength in the face of unimaginable loss serves as an inspiration to others who have faced similar tragedies. As investigators continue to work the case and new evidence occasionally surfaces, there remains hope that additional prosecutions may yet be possible. The pursuit of justice does not end with the death of the primary perpetrators, as there are others who may still be held accountable for their roles in the murders or the cover-up that followed. The mountains around Keddie have witnessed both great beauty and terrible evil. They have seen families find happiness and safety in their remote cabins, and they have seen that safety shattered by violence and hatred. They remember it all: the laughter of children playing in the forest, the tears of those who mourned, the silence of secrets kept too long, and the eventual revelation of truth that brought some measure of peace to those who had waited so long for justice. In the end, the Keddie Cabin Murders remind us that justice may be delayed, but it need not be denied forever. Truth has a way of emerging from even the deepest shadows, and the voices of the innocent will not be silenced by those who would cover up their crimes. Sue Sharp, Johnny Sharp, Tina Sharp, and Dana Wingate deserve to be remembered not just as victims of a brutal crime, but as people who were loved, who had dreams and hopes for the future, and whose lives had meaning beyond the terrible way they ended. The forest remembers them all, and through the continuing efforts of dedicated investigators and the courage of those who refuse to let their story be forgotten, their memory lives on. Justice may have been long delayed, but it has not been entirely denied, and their legacy serves as both a warning about the evil that can lurk in human hearts and a testament to the enduring power of love, truth, and the relentless pursuit of justice. In the quiet moments when the mountain wind stills and the forest holds its breath, those who know the story can almost hear them, four voices calling out from beyond the grave, demanding that their truth be told, their killers be named, and their memory be honored. The Keddie Cabin Murders may never be fully resolved in a legal sense, but the truth has finally emerged from the shadows where it was hidden for so long. The mountains keep all secrets, but eventually, they reveal them all as well.
Hey everyone, thanks so much for listening. If you enjoyed the video, please hit that like and subscribe button, and then share it with your friends. Your support helps us grow and create even more awesome content. We appreciate you being part of the journey.